necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Our country is made up of people that take action. We do not sit idly by and allow evil to be perpetuated on our fellow man without consequence. On this solemn day, we take pause to remember the sacrifices that good men and women have made in the name of peace and our freedom. 150 years ago, on April 12th, our country was torn apart by the most horrific of conflicts, one that would pit father against son, brother against brother. A fight that would inflict wounds that some say fester to this day. When I studied the Civil War, it was at a military academy in Virginia, and it was taught by a retired U.S. Army major. His great-grandfather, a general in the Confederate Army, had fought against my great-great-grandfather at the Battle of Antietam. He taught it to us as the War of Northern Aggression. The Civil War has been given many names: the war between the states, the War of the Rebellion, the Brothers' War, and the late Unpleasantness. Walt Whitman called it the War of Attempted Secession. Confederate General Joseph Johnston called it the War against the States. By whatever name, it was unquestionably the most important event in the life of the nation. It saw the end of slavery and the downfall of a Southern planter aristocracy. It was a watershed of a new political and economic order and the beginning of big industry, big business, and big government. It was the first modern war, and for Americans the costliest, yielding the most American fatalities and the greatest domestic suffering both spiritually and physically. Between 1861 and 1865, Americans made war on each other and killed each other in great numbers, if only to become the kind of country that could no longer conceive of how that was possible. What began as a bitter dispute over Union and states' rights ended as a struggle over the meaning of freedom in America. At Gettysburg in 1863, Abraham Lincoln said perhaps more than he knew, the war was about a new birth of freedom. This was a war of such viciousness and sacrifice that there were more casualties during this conflict than all the other wars combined. In fact, over 600,000 people, or 2% of the entire population of the United States, died in the Civil War. The fighting at places like Cold Harbor was so fierce that 7,000 men were killed in the first 20 minutes of battle. Look around you. There's roughly 1,000 people live in the town of Riegelsville. Nearly 7 times that amount of people died in just a blink of an eye. September 17th, 1862 marks the bloodiest day in American history, for it was at dawn on this day that the Battle of Antietam in Sharpsburg, Maryland began. Again, depending on your ancestry and where you were from, this battle had different names. If you're from the South, it's referred to as the Battle of Sharpsburg, and the battle was fought around the Antietam Creek. If you're from the North, it was simply referred to as Antietam. The battle saw the Confederate forces outnumbered by the Union, and yet the Union troops found themselves handicapped by an inept leader by the name of General George McClellan, who was afraid to commit his men in force. In fact, McClellan did such a poor job that President Lincoln relieved him of his command and promoted Ulysses S. Grant to commander of the Union's army. We tend to blur the fact that real people lived through this war and were changed by the event. There were many, many brave soldiers that fought to preserve our way of life. In fact, there are several Civil War veterans that are buried right here in Riegelsville that fought at the Battle of Antietam. There were members of the 128th Pennsylvania Volunteer Company C and were mustered into service in eastern Pennsylvania on August 8, 1862. A typical enlistment in those days was 9 months, if you lived that long. The 3 men were Jonas Nixon, age 30, John Kerbaugh, 24 years old, and his brother-in-law, Frederick Krause, who was 27, all of them privates. The 128th, commanded by Brigadier General Samuel Crawford, faced the 4th Alabama, the 21st Georgian, and the 1st and 3rd North Carolina companies that day. The 1st and 3rd Carolina companies lost all but 66 men. The 128th lost 118 men, including John Kerbaugh, who was fatally wounded when a bullet that shattered Frederick Krause's arm struck him also. Mr. Krause was released from the hospital in Philadelphia in December of 1862. He returned to Riegelsville and purchased, ironically enough, the home where I live now. He served as postmaster of Riegelsville for 17 years. Jonas Nixon died from his battle wounds on October 4th, 1862, in a hospital to the west of us here in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. These were brave men who fought disease, foul weather, wearing poor clothing, eating terrible food, as well as fighting the Confederate forces. Not all the men that fought the Civil War were as old as these three. Private Johnny Cook, a bugler with Battery B, 4th U.S., was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Antietam. He was only 15. Antietam in the North is considered a turning point of the war and a victory for the Union because it ended Lee's strategic campaign, his first invasion of the North. And it allowed President Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, which took effect on January 1st, 1863. It proclaimed the freedom of 3.1 million of the nation's 4 million slaves and immediately freed 50,000 of them, with the rest freed as Union armies advanced. The Union victory and Lincoln's proclamation played a considerable role in dissuading the governments of France and Britain from recognizing the Confederacy. Some suspect that they were planning to do so in the aftermath of another Union defeat. Memorial Day, perhaps more than any other day, was born of human necessity. It began as a ritual of remembrance and reconciliation after the Civil War. Our tradition includes an obligation to honor the sacrifices made by our nation to earn our freedom. With the Civil War, death, sacrifice, and rebirth bring the true meaning of Memorial Day in focus. As the Civil War was coming to a close in the spring of 1865, women's auxiliaries of the North and South moved from providing relief to the families and soldiers on their own sides to joining in efforts to preserve and decorate the graves of both sides. In fact, initially it was called Decoration Day. A tradition called Decoration Day honoring Confederate soldiers continues to this day throughout the South. In 1868, General John A. Logan, the first commander of the Grand Army of the Republic, issued a general order establishing May 30th as an official Memorial Day to pay respect to all those who had died in war and in peace. By the late 1800s, many communities across the country had begun to celebrate Memorial Day, and after World War I, observances also began to honor those who had died in all of America's wars. In 1971, Congress declared Memorial Day a national holiday to be celebrated the last Monday in May. Perhaps General Logan's proclamation was simply the making official of what the nation yearned for and spontaneously began to form after the near total destruction of the Civil War. It is that sharing of loss, honoring the sacrifices of those who made possible the lives we enjoy today, and family connections across the generations that keep Memorial Day in our hearts and always will. Yes, we often find ourselves distracted by our busy lives, but we must never forget the sacrifices of our fallen heroes. Those people willing to forego comfort and safety in order to keep us free and safe here at home. Take a moment today to reflect on what it is to be a free American, able to enjoy your life and the lives of your family. Understand that freedom did not come easily or without tremendous cost. Please remember the servicemen and women that have and do to this day make us a strong and proud nation. God bless you and your families. Thank you very much.